Right now, we're going to get started with our hot tech 3D printing. I'd like to welcome Derek Mathers, Director of Advanced Applications Development for Whirl Inc. Hey, Derek.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
You can stand or without.
Yeah, so I'll use this microphone at first, but as we're kind of filling out the room and getting ready to go, I always love having presentations in a little bit smaller rooms, right? So it's like compact and you can get the heat going, but we have a really fascinating 3D printing technology panel today. So on this panel, we've got some of the leaders of the most interesting companies in the 3D printing industry, which is quite small, but becoming a continuously more important tool for design engineers and stuff like that in medtech. But very, very quickly expanding to all different types of applications. And I think that one thing that this panel can confirm is that we all truly believe that additive manufacturing is going to be the future of building parts for the human body. And it currently is, and it's only going to expand further. So what I've done is I've pulled together a couple images, a couple interesting case studies and stories about how 3D printing is used in our healthcare economy today. So we're going to start off talking about anatomical models. Then we're going to dive in a little bit to surgical guides and how using that anatomic information, we can now build guides, templates, stuff like that to help surgeons do a great procedure every time. And then we're going to dive into a little bit about implants and explants. So talking about Class 3 regulated devices and everything that goes into 3D printing for those types of devices. And then finally, we're going to touch on a couple more forward-looking topics, but realizing that they're not so forward-looking anymore. And in fact, in other economies, bioprinting and pharmacoprinting is actually taking off much faster than here in the United States. So it's going to be a really, really fun panel. My name's Derek. My background is actually in materials science and marketing, but I sold 3D printers during my undergraduate career. That's how I paid for undergrad, was selling machines for Stratasys. And then from there, I actually went to work for a design firm called Whirl. We're based in Minneapolis and have offices in Shanghai and London as well, doing product development stuff. And then I'm going to have each of our panelists actually introduce themselves. So unfortunately, Severine's not here today. She works for an amazing company called OPM Biomedical, which is up in Connecticut. And they actually do additive manufacturing for cranial maxillofacial implants, cranial, facial, and spine. They actually already have approvals on all three using a plastic to do so, using PEC. So it's a little bit about Severine. We're going to talk about her technology today, but since she's not on the panel, we're going to focus a lot more on what Katie, Scott, and Gaurav have their companies in terms of offerings. So Scott, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, let's get started.
So I'm Scott Rader. I'm currently the head of healthcare for Stratasys. And my background coming here was PhD in material science. I was an academic professor at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, and then have been in a number of companies that have really broken ground in minimally invasive surgery. Always been on the therapeutic side, so it's very, very interesting transition to move into the capability side.
My name is Katie Weimer, and I run 3D Systems Services Center for healthcare. So everything we do in Denver for 3D Systems is around manufacturing of medical devices using 3D printing. Background in engineering, and have spent 10 years specifically focused in 3D printing in healthcare.
And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gaurav Manchanda with Formlabs. We're just up the road in Somerville or Cambridge, depending what side of the road you're on specifically. I can say more about our work, but my background is in healthcare policy, clean tech, and additive. So,
wonderful. Awesome. So our first topic today is going to be all about anatomical modeling. And so I'm probably going to botch this definition, but I would say it's all about being able to take digital anatomy, whether surface scans or DICOM data, which is your CT or MRI output, which is sliced image files, and converting that into the real anatomy to be able to understand that in a physical presence. So right now, using a 3D printer to characterize that digital file into a physical reality. Anatomical modeling has a lot of different benefits, from training and simulation for surgeons to actually practice a procedure before they do it, but also intraoperatively. So you can actually have a piece of anatomy, both pre-surgical and post-surgical, to be able to optimize it during that flow. And it's truly being used all over the place. So my first question for you guys is, tell me about your favorite part that your company has manufactured, or your favorite object that has been manufactured by your company that you think has a very interesting story specifically for healthcare, and either has already printed or will print in the immediate future.
Sure. So I'll start off, Derek. And so I think that I'd add one more definition to your anatomical modeling, and that is how medical device manufacturers, I don't know how many of you in the room have ever had the problem of really what is going to be the inanimate model that you use as your challenge device in validation and verification. And so there are a number of examples on Stratasys' website where partners such as Medtronic, Cardiovascular Systems, and other companies have utilized this technology. But I think that the one that's most evocative both to those of us in healthcare and the layperson is how is a patient treated? So 3 years ago, there was a young girl born, twins, and they came from the Midwest to Boston Children's Hospital. And Violet was born, if you're familiar with a cleft palate, she was actually born with a cleft palate that went all the way to the top of her skull up to the fontanelles. It's called a Tessier cleft. And it was an embodiment of many of the 3 topics that you introduced, Eric. It was not only what can you do in terms of anatomical model and what can you do in terms of surgical cutting guides, but what 3D printing was used was to radically change the course of caregivers and how they address the needs of this very unique patient. And the story was covered in video form and also in print by the New York Times. What I loved about it was it really talked about impact. Anatomical models without impact, without the story behind them and the rationale of why to use them are, to me, quite boring. And so net summary was they took a surgery that they had booked the operating room with 7 different subspecialties operating on Violet, was the little girl's name. They took a booked room from 36 hours and they did the procedure in a little over, I believe it was 13 or 14 hours, so less than half the time than they expected. Why were they able to do that? They were able to actually take the CT scan of the hard structures, the bony structures of Violet's face, and when they wanted to take out this middle section that was the cleft, and then reassemble her face in a narrower fashion, they were actually able to create those cutting guides and do the dissection very, very precisely. So they took 6 different models of the skull and they tried different patterns. And what they found was that on the desktop prior to surgery, they could figure out where do I want to cut. Instead of making it up in the operating room, they went with a very precise series of objectives of what they wanted to create. And when they put Violet's face back together, it fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, reducing any kind of fixation, reducing the operative time, and really making it much more precise and being able to pre-visualize how are they going to use components of bone that might otherwise be wasted to put into other areas where they're going to close various gaps in the formation of her skull. Really powerful story, and because our face is what we present to the world, that's the impact. A little girl is going to grow up with a much more normal looking appearance. And that, to me, is the reason.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. For me, we've been involved in many anatomical models, like Scott had mentioned, and there's a couple things that always ring true. One, you're solving a problem in the operating room, something that can't be done or wouldn't be done as well without that anatomical model. Probably seen around 100,000 models being printed throughout our operation over the last 10, 15 years, and the case that stands out is very similar to what Scott kind of presented, and one, it was surrounding the face, right? Your face is so personal, as Scott said, it is your presentation to the world, and 2, something substantially meaningful comes from these cases when you're applying your technology, your medical device to children. And the case that comes to mind for me is a set of conjoined twins out of Montefiore, Jaden and Anais McDonald, that were separated, craniopagus twins. Their skulls were fused together and their brains were together when they were born, and they were separated a little over a year ago, or right at about a year ago, from Montefiore Hospital. And the use of these anatomical models, and I was lucky enough to be in the operating room during that case, the use of the anatomical models during the surgery was something I had never seen before at the caliber that it was. There were points in the operation, and the surgeons will say, even for them, where they weren't sure if they could or should continue the case. And it was because of the anatomical model that they had in the sterile field and in a separate model of the brains that was outside the sterile field. They were comfortable enough to proceed with the case, where without it, they likely would have called it off and the twins would still be would be conjoined today. So that use case for anatomical models is everything good about this technology as it's applied to treating and helping patients. You know, it's focused around a problem that couldn't be solved otherwise. It's directed towards a largely untreated demographic, these really complex craniofacial diseases and disorders. And the use of the technology is very local, right? It's in the OR. It is used for decision-making at the time of surgery, and it was really something I had never seen, the reliance of these anatomical models in the operating room like I did for that conjoined twins case.
Sure. I'll take some more liberty with the question. So I heard favorite model to be printed in the near future as well, and I'll start with the more straightforward question and maybe with a different spin on it. So Formlabs, we manufacture and supply the printer and the resin or the ink. We are not a service bureau. We don't print models for customers, but we have a number of customers in this space that are printing models for a variety of use cases I think that most of us are familiar with. I think the stories that I take away from the radiologists or the surgeon or the maker spaces that we serve, and just for context, we're talking about 25 to 30,000 Formlabs printers out in the wild or in the market to date, and several hundred, to our knowledge, several hundred at least, being used for or by medical service bureaus, by radiology labs and the like. So everything that we hear is from our customers, and I think the main takeaway that I hear from the radiology resident or the director of a certain department or program or what have you is that the barrier to entry is far lower than it has been historically, and I think there's a lot of value to the service bureau approach because it reduces that initial capital investment. And I just love hearing the stories about a medical resident or a rising star in a given healthcare system winning a grant for $10,000 and printing 125 models in a given year for the entire hospital system. I think we're hearing really interesting stories as a result of the increased access. So that's the first answer. The second answer is a bit more personal, much more personal, where I don't have a medical background myself, but come from a family of doctors and joke now about this, where my son was born at 25 weeks, spent about 6 months in the NICU. I joke that I have a NICU fellowship by proxy, but he's doing well now. And countless CTs and MRIs and what have you, and doing very, very well cognitively, but one of the outstanding issues or results is a number of gross motor delays, and he's wearing AFOs or ankle orthotics. And when I first approached Formlabs, I was talking all about the 3D print, the effect or impact that 3D printing can have in the orthotics market, and looking at coming straight from a leading hospital system or a leading hospital here in Boston, and from their orthotics lab, which is very well resourced, but still producing orthotics in a very archaic way from the 1950s or 60s. And what Formlabs will be doing in the near future is 3D printing orthotics in partnership with leading hospital systems, and thanks to new materials and new print engines coming out in the near future, and that will be my favorite part when it comes out. So,
fantastic. Thank you very much. So one quick question: have any of you printed your own anatomy ever? Oh, nice.
Sure.
That's fantastic.
Not only is it printed, it's also published in a couple papers. Yeah.
Really?
So early, yeah. You need patient consent, right, to do some of this. And
Yeah.
I was early on in the development of surgical planning about 6 or 7 years ago, and I had a cone beam CT taken and we needed to do some studies, and instead of worrying about getting patient consent from someone else, we used My Anatomy, which was quite convenient. It's a little bit it's a little bit strange to think of yourself at especially a facial skeleton level. You look a lot different without your skin and your soft tissue.
That's incredible.
It's next to your mirror.
Has anyone in the audience ever printed their own anatomy? No one. Oh my gosh, you got to do it. It is pretty
It's the
pretty
latest
fascinating to
trend.
hold on to your own. I've held on to my own ankle before.
Just get in a bar fight while you're in Boston and go to the hospital.
Yeah, just to get a
Just to start the process.
CT scan.
Yeah.
Oh man. So, but however, when you're holding on to these anatomical models, for example, the one that I had printed, and I've lucked out because we've got a Connex 500, which is a Stratasys machine at Worrell, so I was able to print it in kind of a soft/rigid material over there. But however, most of the materials on the market right now, at least for fused deposition modeling, are rigid and honestly I've talked to multiple clinicians that when they hold on to a printed FDM heart, yes, it is the almost exact anatomy, but it doesn't behave anything like an actual heart or any of the material properties that a heart would have. And so my next question for you guys is, how is your firm, or how is your company, or maybe yourself personally, interested in advancing these materials to make them more similar to the human body, more biomimetic? It's something we talk about all the time in design, but we've kind of been failing to see it come across. And you know, Scott, your company has an amazing platform with PolyJet, just in being able to do these beautiful multi-material models, different durometers. How do you guys look at the future of healthcare-specific resins for anatomical modeling?
Sure, so we have to understand where 3D printing came from. And 3D printing came from the idea and the concept of allowing engineers who are doing computer-aided design to be able to take it and realize it into a physical object. So quite frankly, in terms of modeling the human body, by and large, our materials suck. So that's where we are. We have elastomers that don't feel like adipose tissue. We have hard materials that by their own definition, being polymeric materials, will never have the elastic modulus of a real bone. We're not doing composite materials in PolyJet. So when we looked at this, we learned also one other item that we've been working on for years, which is digital materials. So the Connex and then the J750 class printers can simultaneously jet 3 materials plus a support, or 6 materials and a support. And when you do that, you come up with some very unique things, which is, we call it voxel printing. A voxel is really just a 3-dimensional pixel. So as opposed to the number of pixels on your screen, we have a resolution in 3 dimensions. And when we look at that, that gives us the ability to replicate the heterogeneity of the human body. And so we've done that with local folks here at MIT, at Harvard. We've done this to be able to do research. We can talk a little bit later about the needs of bioprinting. But when we think about this opportunity to control microstructure, microstructure controls macrostructure, and then we have to also invest in creating materials that are specific to replicas of the human body. And it starts to get even more complex because you may want to do practice for your operation under fluoroscopy. So you may need to be able to measure the radiographic density. So at Duke University, we've been making golden master replicants of breast phantoms out of CT data by actually taking the Hounsfield unit, the grayscale unit, and actually printing out those breasts. Why? Again, the important consideration is, how do you bring a new digital mammography system to market? Well, do you really want to double dose 150 to 250 women? No. It's controversial enough getting 1 mammogram every other year, whatever the ever-changing standards are going towards. And it's much more powerful to really think about, how can you mimic the human body? And I know my colleagues are probably working on this as well. Many people are working on it, and it's happening in the academic laboratories as well. And it's very, very exciting to see the progress in my involvement in this industry for 3 years. Just major differentiation of what I see every single year being presented compared to where we started.
Great. I think one interesting topic for this group in particular is, why is it important to have biomimetic anatomical models? I think one for you guys that's very interesting is, how is it going to change medical device testing, right? So you've got a device, you want to take it to market. You've got to get a cadaver, you have to test it in its, towards its indicated use. How great would it be if you could just order a model, order 10 models, order 100 models, and do that under the control of your own benchtop testing instead of necessarily in a lab? I think we can all agree medical device testing is only getting harder and more strenuous and less easy. So I think that's a very interesting use case when we truly can, again, print validated or medical models, anatomical models that truly do act and replicate human tissue. A couple other interesting areas where I think this will change the practice of medicine is in training. So when you're a physician, say you're training in a certain specialty, you go to the cadaver lab again, right? And imagine if you're a pediatric surgeon, cadavers don't exist for that, and for very good and ethical reasons. But you're then now going to have to go and train or go and do that procedure in a hospital on a kid. That's a challenge to ask any surgeon. So again, for use in pediatrics, for use for specific disease and deformities such as tumors or clefts or something as rare as a conjoined twin, you could actually print and practice, do surgical training and teaching substantially more efficient, I believe. And the last one is in third world countries, again, where they don't have sophisticated training programs. Third world countries, places where, again, if you could order a specimen, again, fake specimen that's validated and feels and acts like human tissue, it could truly change and revolutionize, I think, teaching at medical device or for medical institutions in third world countries.
Katie, if I could just add, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is how do you actually do some of the experimental protocols for validation and verification? And I think an important point to consider is, I know we had this trouble in a company back in Silicon Valley, Novocept. What is the structure and size of a non-pregnant uterus? Turns out nobody had ever studied it. It took us a year and a half at a significant burn rate for a startup to figure that out, to create a device for menorrhagia. This is replicated every single time that I talk with our customers, small and large. And if we connect it back to some bigger trends that were talked about earlier today, how can you actually do the 3D printing to put in sensors to measure what your device is doing? How can we also utilize big data? So you may ask yourself, if you wanted to come up with a new scoliosis procedure to straighten predominantly young teenage girls' backs, well, you could do it and you could sort through tens of thousands of cadavers that are donated every single year and hope for one or two. But quite frankly, I'd rather hope for none. I hope nobody dies from scoliosis. So maybe a better way to do it is just go to a hospital and get some CTs. So for an order of magnitude of big data today, if you look at the Mayo Clinic across all of their campuses, they do 970 CT and MRI scans every single day. It's really easy to get that data. That data's out there. And when we talk later about the segmentation, what are some of the barriers? How do we do it? It's how do we get that big data and how do we operate on it? And that is, to me, transformative to our processes of making sure we design it once, we design it right, and we get into the marketplace in the right way. Because clinical trials are ungodly expensive.
I'll just add on before the next slide, Derek. It's important to realize or take a step back and realize where we are, or remember where we are as an industry. So even with the materials that have been out for years and the low-hanging use cases, we're talking about 1 or 2 or 3% market penetration right now after decades of work and effort and investment and what have you. And a 3D printing community, even in a tech hub like Boston, that is largely unfamiliar with how to go from DICOM to STL to finished part and what have you with today's solutions, right? So I think all of the companies on the panel are making investments into better materials and materials that will address additional use cases, but we're still scratching the surface with the bread and butter, if you will.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And it's curious to see if some of those new materials don't help drive market penetration based on a higher perceived value of that organ being interesting, right? But at the end of the day, the global 3D printing industry is $6.1 billion. The global medtech market is $460 billion. And so my next couple of questions literally stole Scott's slides from the RSNA, but I gave him the citation there too.
Thank you.
But this is a wonderful infographic because what needs to happen is a business model evolution in the 3D printing industry for the ability to cater these models to all the different clinicians, like we were talking about, whether third world country or domestic. And so this is what kind of the business model looks like for a centralized service bureau that actually is manufacturing those anatomical models and then quickly shipping them to the hospital. An alternative model is where the hospital itself does that additive manufacturing, requiring it to acquire a very expensive machine, an initial capital investment, the know-how, the technicians to operate it, the software sometimes, which can be $100K per seat. Materialized mimics can cost up to $100,000 per seat, which is a lot of money. And so my first question is, Katie, 3D Systems is a centralized service bureau in a lot of ways, even though it's a lot of other things as well. And so how do you guys differentiate yourselves relative to hospitals that might already have a 3D printer in-house or something like that?
Yeah, and I think it's the reality of the future of 3D printing in healthcare is this technology will continue to be more localized, and certainly backup services or service centers such as the one that I'm lucky enough to be a part of, they have a role, but at the end of the day, as this technology is localized, as I like to think of it, the pie gets bigger, right? Once you get this technology in the hands of the people that are that are truly the end users, the surgeons, the pie gets bigger, the use cases quadruple, this exponential growth. But as you mentioned earlier, it's an upfront capital investment, many times of which hospitals aren't necessarily prepared to do, especially for devices such as anatomical models that don't have reimbursement. So how do you pay for this whole system? That being said, it's already happening. The movement is already happening. There are several hospitals that already have printers and are doing this locally. But we see an advantage, at least at the facility that I'm at, in that we sell the materials, we sell 3D printers and also have a backup service, and we understand the use case because we do it ourselves. So we're better able to service the hospitals and the clinicians that when they have problems or issues, because we do it ourselves as well. And in many cases too, there are several different varieties. I mean, all three of us have very different printers and platforms that we sell to the industry. And maybe a hospital buy one or two or three, but those of us behind the table, we have the advantage that we always have the latest and greatest technology because it's our own. So all the time we see hospitals that perhaps bought one certain type of 3D printing technology that, say, prints in very full color, vibrant models, but they don't have a printer that prints in transparent, clear, and can be sterilized and used in the operating room. So we see ourselves called on quite often for more sophisticated models, for those that truly are, and we'll talk about it, I think, in a little bit, truly are medical devices. And so we see ourselves as backup service in that regard as well.
That's awesome. So because some anatomical models are considered medical devices at the end of the day, because they're used either intraoperatively or there's been more things coming out by the FDA. How do you guys manage your end users, so the surgeons themselves, on saying what you're creating is a medical device or is not, based on that type of model?
So, all right, we talked earlier, this is one of the landmines. The landmine of this is that, and it's very, very different for the two different processes. So if you're a centralized bureau and you're advertising this as having any role in diagnostics, you have to treat your quality system as if it's a medical device, where working with a company who our wintertime headquarters are in Israel and our summertime headquarters is in Minneapolis, we actually have a wonderful Israeli term called balagan. It's like confusion, disarray, and sadness all rolled into one. I think that's where we are with the FDA. When we were down there several weeks ago and we all participated, the biggest problem right now with the FDA is they don't know whether or not a 3D printer should be a medical device. Well, did we ever have this question before? Is an injection molder a medical device? Is a CNC router, is a CNC Swiss turn machine, lathe, is that a medical device? No, clearly not. Do we need to have standards, and do we have to work with our customers to ensure that when they have created digital data that the output of our printers is accurate, it is to their intent, and we don't mess up their planning for surgery or their preparation for surgery by putting extraneous data in? Absolutely. Absolutely. But there are standards and guidelines that already exist of how to do that. So we've got a long road ahead. I don't see that any of these would be formally codified by the FDA on either business model or even hybrid business models where you could have a service bureau that does the segmentation and it could be printed locally at the hospital. It's another third option. I mean, you can conceive of many different ways to fulfill this. I think that where it's ultimately going to come is that the FDA is going to demand to see that any product that is coming off of a 3D printer is valid to the intent of the data that went in. And there will be separate regulatory processes for the software and then ultimately the print.
Since someone backed away from the panel last minute, do we have anyone from the FDA who wants to join us up here? We have an extra seat available. I think for those who weren't in Chevy Chase a month ago or so, the main takeaway from my perspective was that the FDA will be looking more closely at software providers and service bureaus and any anatomical model that's printed for diagnostic use, quote unquote. But if it's in the practice of medicine or a reference model or what have you, then it will not be considered a medical device. And our marketing teams can all handle that sort of direct order, but the complication is once a surgeon receives a model in his or her hands, it's impossible to know whether it was diagnostic or not. There are a number of publications out there showing that the course of action has changed as surgery was canceled after seeing a 3D printed model, and we, regardless of how accurate, I think all of us have quite accurate models coming out of our machines, but we can't control the surgeon or the entire workflow on site at every hospital that's using one of our printers as well. And of course, each hospital and each healthcare system has its own quality control systems and necessary approvals and whatnot, and sterile field requirements and things of that nature. But I think that's where the gray area that Scott more eloquently described comes from, is that we can market it appropriately, but reality is still going to be reality.
I think just to add one more point, I think this is, I'm not sure if there's another instance in medical device manufacturing where the hospital now takes on the liability of the legal manufacturer. And it's a paradigm shift that I think 3D printing is really the only technology that enables it. As healthcare becomes more patient specific. Again, if there's another use case of this with you guys in the audience, I'd love to hear it and hear how the story ends. But when the hospital takes on the legal manufacturing of medical devices, and yet the FDA very clearly states they do not regulate the practice of medicine, and now you have radiologists being manufacturers of medical devices, they're at a very interesting loophole that those of us behind this table don't get to enjoy. That being said, there are patients, there are people on the other end receiving these devices are being used on, and right now it's a little bit of a Wild West for what's being done locally, the difference in quality, the difference in regulation, and the difference even in accuracy of these models when it's done in the hands of a clinician. Versus when it's done by those of us as medical device companies. It's a very different product. And again, I can't think of another, nor am I aware of another situation like this ever in medical device. So we will see how it ends in the coming years, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, there's a couple new business models coming down the line. One of them is where an imaging company themselves, within the portal that the radiologist is using, can export that file, send it off to a 3D printing service bureau like a 3D Systems or others that exist, throughout the world, and to have those models printed, and then the royalty actually goes to the 3D printing company, and they deliver it to the hospital. I think the overall goal right now is that we know statistically that using a preoperative model over the course of a procedure is going to benefit that procedure in some way, shape, or form. I think now the biggest question is what model is going to be able to scale this the most to get to that market penetration that we were talking about. And so, at face value, this definitely could be one of them. But my next question for you guys pushes back a little bit on 3D printing as a tool. I think we'll talk about this one and then we're going to dive into the rest of the topics because we're a little over not over on time yet, but we're going to be pinched to get through all four. Is that mixed reality has become a very interesting output tool for DICOM data. So instead of just exporting, this line is not exclusive, so one technology has not disrupted the rest. We still definitely use single film, cross-sectional stuff like that. However, now there's new tools coming out, and this one was a NYU-based company called MassDevice. So using a HoloLens headset and very soon being able to use a Magic Leap headset, which is supposed to come out for around $1,200 and be the size of glasses, they're able to take this CT or MR data and show beautiful renderings of, on the left, diffusion tractography to see how water's moving through the brain and identify where the tumor is. In the middle, being able to actually see the screws in 3 dimensions in the spine, and then on the far side, seeing how the vasculature in the brain is actually moving towards those tumors as well. So the important part is just like a 3D printed model, these AR-based models can be viewed collaboratively where people are wearing multiple headsets or using mobile to point at the same object. So my question for you guys is when have you found that 3D printing is, because healthcare is all about the hands, more important or would it be a better tool than mixed reality for preoperative planning?
Better is a strong term. I think both have their roles. And when I think about virtual reality or assisted reality, or mixed modality, you're really looking at, you now have to bring together a bunch of disciplines and just think about what it takes in terms of a software engineer to be able to make an algorithm that's going to allow you to cut a 3D model and get the appropriate surfaces. It's a monumental task. So we default to doing repetitive training steps where we can program what's right and what's wrong, and it's pretty binary. And the collaboration by everybody wearing a headset is also replicated by if I take a model off the printer and I hold it in front of 12 physicians, they all get to see it and they get to touch it. So, we're in this wonderful spot where, the existing practitioners of today have grown up in a very, very tactile universe, and the youth who are playing video games, who are going to drive our cars using, joysticks sitting in a centralized room somewhere out in West Virginia, those guys are perfectly comfortable with AR and gaming. Where are we going to be? Who knows? I think both have an incredibly different role when you want to do something that's very, very unique. It's easier to create a model when you want to do something repetitive, where you want to have 20 residents do 300 catheterizations. AR or VR is potentially the solution.
Just my quick opinion on it, I think it's a phenomenal technology that will absolutely open up the door for new devices and new use cases in the OR, but until humans are no longer physical, i.e. we are holograms, I think there's always going to be a need for physical anatomical models. Surgeons are physical, they are, they're very tactile, they like to touch and feel just as they would in the operating room. And for me, I think it's going to be a while before something like VR, AR, although it again is fantastic and has many use cases, truly makes anatomical models obsolete.
And there is, this was discussed about a month ago as well, but there is science behind why people learn better with holding an actual model in their hands. So to put this in more simple terms, if I were going to coach a basketball or football team, I wouldn't give all of the players VR headsets and then throw an imaginary ball around. So why would I teach my physician in that way? If you're using your hands and if you're using your hands to practice for a procedure that will lead to some sort of tactile feedback or response, the science is out there to show that it is far better to use an actual physical model. Some of our best customers are VR companies and mixed reality companies. We love the solution, but this is just feedback from surgeons.
And when the software engineers actually play with the model from one of our printers, it's very powerful.
Absolutely. So My next kind of topic area is going to be in surgical guides and templates, and we'll just touch on this pretty briefly, but it's something of tremendous value for a surgeon to be able to go in and cut and drill only exactly where they need it. And by using these different types of buffers that you would have in a similar, right, because orthopedics is so similar to carpentry. Well, in carpentry, you have fixtures everywhere that enable you to go in and make those cuts exactly how you want them. And so these are really a boon for being able to do that in procedures. When I was watching this amazing video on a case study about one of the world's first successful face transplants that was done at the Mayo Clinic, I all of a sudden had to pause in the middle of the video. I was watching it with some friends because I recognized a face and I recognized a name. That Katie was actually on site showing the surgeons how to do the operation on site at the Mayo Clinic. And so Katie, tell us a little bit about what interests you in surgical guides and templates, and maybe a little bit about why they were important for a face transplant procedure.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure you recognize the gigantic glasses, and that's what cued you off in the video. But they help me see really, really well. But something like a facial transplantation, right? Think of the problem. So you've got a patient that is obviously going in, and part of the face is being removed, and this includes skin, muscle, nerves, other soft tissues, and ultimately bony anatomy. And then all this happens in a very tight time frame, and a lot of times the donor, when they come in, and once they pass all the blood matches and other testing, it also has to be a bony fit as well, right? When you dock the donor face onto the recipient, you truly only have one chance to do it. You have a very limited window of time to do it, as many times these donors are often donating other parts of their body as well. So you really get one shot, and there's no going back, both for the recipient whose face is being removed. Again, it's not an option to pause in the middle of that and go, you know what, I don't think this donor face is going to work. Let me just put all this back on and wait for the next one. It's truly not an option in these cases. Everything has to fit, and as you guys know, the bones of the body are what make up our form and function. So the bony fit of these small, delicate facial structures had to be aligned perfectly. And when you put the donor face onto the recipient, it had to match truly perfectly. So again, both for the form and function of the patient moving forward, basic functions such as breathing and eating and talking and chewing allow these patients to regain their place in society, which is the whole point of doing this transplant in the first place. So the guides allowed a couple things. One, to practice this procedure, and we did about almost 20 cadaver labs where we had practiced taking a donor and placing it on a mock recipient in the lab. It allowed the surgeons to do the exact procedure and practice it multiple times before going in the operating room. And two, it truly upped the percentage of success of this type of operation when we were in the operating room. So every bony cut was pre-planned for the best bony healing, so that the osteotomies, the cuts were designed specifically so that it had the most overlap between the donor and the recipient for the best healing, for the best fixation, for the best fit. And in some of these cases, you could even model, for example, if the donor's teeth weren't aligned, there was an opportunity to even correct that, so even improve the facial function of that donor tissue, and it was placed on the face. And ultimately, when these guides were used in the operating room, it truly was phenomenal use of the technology going on in multiple rooms. And again, it all had to be done in a very quick time frame.
That's incredible. Gaurav?
Yeah, and this just reminds me of a few other important use cases for these models and for all the information coming from the DICOM. So in addition to preoperative planning, of course, there are cutting guides and surgical guides. I think molds for implants is something that we're hearing more about from our customers.
Indirect use.
Yeah, exactly. So we have, and this is another example of a surgeon will do what a surgeon thinks is best and get approval as necessary on site, where one of the largest healthcare systems on the East Coast of the US received the necessary approvals to use our dental surgical guide resin for an orthopedic surgery in an elbow, for a patient having elbow surgery, and used the dental SG, we call it, as a mold for PMMA, or bone cement, and that bone cement was then implanted in the patient successfully we'll have some marketing stories coming out about it in the future, but naturally we can't advertise that use case or recommend that use case, and but these things do happen. And so I would just highlight, guides, preoperative planning, molds for PMMA and for prostheses as well, right? So silicone for the actual exterior of the face, or a lot of ear reconstruction folks are using our same materials for molds for those sort of applications as well. So it's amazing what you can do with the same set of information.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to kind of fast forward ahead to something that I found very, very interesting. I got to go to a hospital in the Henan province in western China a couple months ago. And in this hospital, it sees 20,000 patients a day. So that's how many people are moving to Denver right now per month, by the way. That's a side note plug for Colorado. But 20,000 patients a day. So there's 4 billion people in the world that have little or no access to healthcare. And it is in part due to this. They travel for 4 hours to see a doctor for 1 minute. And in that 1 minute session, the doctor is actually wearing a helmet because the patients are so angry that they were only able to see that doctor for 1 minute. On the flip side, what we're finding is that there's literally hundreds of different Class 1 exempt devices, and some bridging their way into Class 2, that can be used literally as medical device. And so right now, one of my friends, Ashley Dara Dotes, she heads up Field Ready, is down, I believe, in Cuba and some of the other places that were hit by Hurricane Irma. And they're actually using this to manufacture things like umbilical cord clamps, which a minimum purchase order from Becton Dickinson is 10,000 units. A village in Cuba doesn't need 10,000 umbilical cord clamps. They need 1 or 2 on that day. And so what are you guys' firms doing? And one example is Surgical Guides, is that an Indian firm of just 4 people is now producing these surgical guides to be used in spine surgery. And they're using a cheap sub-$1,000 fused deposition modeling printer to do it. How is your firm thinking about extending healthcare to those 4 billion people? And I know it's very progressive technology, very expensive technology, highfalutin procedures, but on a more practical level, is this something that you guys are thinking about?
So we're certainly thinking about it in multiple levels, and I think more importantly, our customers are thinking about it. So as a company that sells, the vast majority of our revenue does come from the sales of machines and materials. When we think about what our customers are doing, we populate the price performance curve. And a great example is our partnership over time with RoboHand, who have created banks of up to 50 or 100 megabots to create prostheses on the order of $100 and $150 for a actuatable hand. And so we see, going beyond these surgical cutting guides and the examples that you shared, Derek, that we have quite a number of use cases that are being pioneered by our customers. And I think what we have to do as manufacturers is to continue to ensure that the global supply chain of materials that are not going to cause problems. In other words, we close the gaps on biocompatibility, sterilization, worldwide qualifications, certification. It's something that we constantly look at, and on an annual basis take a look at our roadmap and where can we do that. And so today we're actively working on solution sets in digital dentistry, from implants to cutting guides and everything else in India. And so we always look to find a local partner, somebody that really knows what the healthcare system is like. And that's critical. I wouldn't ever imagine that I could work in a hospital where I'd have 1 minute per patient and see that many patients in a day. I wouldn't know anything about them. It's bad enough we're only about 15 minutes here in the United States in terms of a consult. So you need to know locally what's happening, partner with the physicians, the hospitals, the medical producers, the medical manufacturers there. They know what those markets need.
Sure. Side note, when I was working in healthcare policy, it was in West Africa with the health ministry in Liberia for a few years. And the interesting part here is, as I was mentioning earlier, we've scratched the surface here in the US, and the ability to leapfrog technology and leapfrog workflows and regulations and what have you is much greater in emerging markets where you might not have all of the complications that we have in a more advanced market. So we're certainly thinking quite a bit about the emerging market or developing country community, and have, similar to the others, partnered with organizations and maker spaces and health ministries in such markets to kind of help build the ecosystem, right? So we talk a lot about, as an industry, we talk quite a bit about the human capital gap and how do we fill the clinical engineer or the clinical radiologist or the effectively the person doing the segmentation of these models. How do we fill that human capital gap here? And as curriculum is being developed in, let's say, rural China or Western Africa, these sort of leapfrog opportunities can really influence how the new classes are educated in those markets. So it's very high on our radar.
That's fantastic. And one example that I've seen of this is just the fact that there's now a robotic dentist that's done, I think, just under 1,000 successful procedures in China. So it's literally bringing together 3D printed surgical guides, automation, object recognition using 2D images. As you can see, the machine will move in like that to understand where to do the cuts. So it's got 3D printed surgical guides, and on top of that, they're additively manufacturing the teeth that they're installing. And so this is an example of, given 3D printed teeth and given additive manufacturing machine, people are now able to completely disrupt the way that dentistry would be delivered. And so that means you could have 5 of these robots actually not only increasing access, but drastically improving. It's like the reverse innovation thing that I'm sure plenty of you in the medtech community are familiar with. So given that there's a time gap, and this was going to be a lot about Severin's company, was because they were featured in the show Bones, because the implant that they manufacture is made out of PEK, or polyether ketone, which stays around a lot longer in a crime scene than the human bone itself. So as you can imagine, this is actually the start to a Bones episode, which I think is pretty fascinating. But at the end of the day, in orthopedics, we deal with a ton of waste. One surgeon who 3D prints his own solutions, named Dr. Paul Durso, talks about it as being a smorgasbord of waste and nowhere to put any of the stuff. In fact, it wasn't until 2007 that we had the first 3D printed cranial implant, which was done by a surgeon in Belgium. So my biggest question here, and this one's more for Katie, is titanium good enough? Because I've heard from some people that have 3D printed titanium implants that the thermal properties are kind of horrendous. Like, they can't take hot showers, can't take cold showers, or be out in the sun. Do you think titanium's good enough, or do you think there's a better solution out there?
No, short answer is no. I don't think it's good enough, and until we've evolved to have titanium in our bodies when we're born, I don't think it'll ever be the best solution out there. And it begs the question for the future of bioprinting and replace like with like, right? That's kind of what we're taught in engineering as well as in medicine. And the short answer is no. I don't think it is. It's the best solution. That being said, it's the best we have right now. It's a very reliable solution. It has years of data. Yep. It's the best solution we have. And I do think the use of 3D printing or titanium being used in 3D printing is opening up a lot of doors, kind of bridging a gap a little bit in a couple ways. One, it's allowing us to print more. It's allowing us to design and implant more complicated, more patient-specific, more sophisticated titanium implants. So I don't know if you guys know, or if you're part of medical device companies that have rigid fixation or implantables, and it's a race for porous structures, where before with traditional manufacturing, printing or designing and implementing a porous structure onto a solid body for things such as bone and growth, it was very complicated to do. There are very sophisticated 3D printed porous structures that are really changing the post-operative results from traditional implants. And the other thing is it's allowing for invention of and clearance of patient-specific implants, right? So again, we're not bound by the cost limits of traditional manufacturing and 3D printing. So you can essentially print a platform of patient-specific devices as cheap as you can, a platform of stock or like components. And so we are seeing, as a company that works with many other medical devices, we're part of about 60 cleared 3D printed devices on the market today, you can see this evolution of design going from how can we print more sophisticated stock components to how do we now implement a business model for patient-specific components in the operating room. And I think that gap is going to then transfer over to it not being titanium, but it's going to be patient-specific bone substitutes and biologics that more accurately represent the human body.
I think the two things that I can add is, one, titanium may be what we have today, but all the examples that you cited, Derek, they're good to haves. The transformative nature of living or not living with a whole portion of your half hemisphere of your skull, that's the transformation in a patient's life. Can we close gaps? Sure. But I think, Katie, was also important to say that what you see coming is exactly what I see coming, which is as we get into the printing of biologics, as we get into printing of scaffold materials that could be resorbed by the body and replaced over time, as we take a look at that state of the art, all the investments that we as an industry, as well as our imaging partners like Philips, GE, Toshiba, now Canon, and others, all this investment to go from patient-specific information to how we create a medical model, how we might create an inert implant of today, or an inert externally worn device, to all that data management, data flow, and all the value propositions are exactly relevant to where this industry needs to go, whether we're doing scaffolding materials, biological printing, or anything else. The roots of this industry go deep, and today I still think we're in that much less than 1% solution set. This industry has a very long way to go. We're very excited about it.
Wonderful. Now, I know we're running pretty close to time, right? This is supposed to end at 3:30? We're over? Nice. All right. A couple more minutes to round up. It's like playing the game Operation. Fitting. All right, so I'm going to speed past this stuff. It's very interesting. If you guys want a copy of this deck, you can definitely take a look after. A lot of companies doing disruptive things in the space. 3M has just announced a PTFE that can be printed on standard SLA machines. So for those of you who have had the pains of manufacturing with Teflon, I think there's something very interesting around the corner for that. A talk I gave at CES actually was about Westworld, so I still have the rights to using their information in presentations, which is pretty fun. Couple final updates on the bioprinting stuff, and then we'll have one more question on this, is a firm called Sichuan Revitech, which is down in South China, now has successfully 3D printed the actual blood vessels for 30 rhesus monkeys in a study. And the implantations were not only successful, but they were actually fully grown back in after 28 days. And now they're in human studies and have been for about 6 months. So this is really, really fascinating stuff. It's bioprinting on the fly. And other companies are paving their way in the space. United Therapeutics has a partnership with 3D Systems. They're printing lung tissue and are on track to be on the market relatively soon, like 3 to 5 years is what they're targeting, from what I understand. Redura is actually maybe the best example of bioprinting in practice, because they print back the dura mater, which is a layer of tissue between the skull and the brain. And they're now in 10,000 patients across the world. It's a Chinese company that's doing 2D bioprinted materials and is actually on the market for post neurosurgery. And then Organovo has to get a new drug application for their kidney or their liver tissue, which is one of the most expensive approvals that you can get. But they're going to be 3D printing back reams of liver tissue in a very relatively short amount of time. And so the final point is that pharmacoprinting, we've got the first FDA-approved drug that's on the market right now for treating epilepsy, and many more in the pipeline behind that, as drug companies try to become more innovative and brand more combined drugs with polypills. So my final question for you guys is, all of these things, if we're able to produce polypills based on our digestion profile, if we're able to produce our own tissues and using technologies that are currently, like PolyJet might be the perfect technology for bioprinting in a lot of ways. How can 3D printing help us really expand the concept of what it means to be human? I mean, this is a very kind of futuristic question, but how do you guys see this impacting the way that we define what a human is?
Since we're over, I'll be very, very short. What it means to be human is to be unique. It is to be personalized. I think all four of us have used the word personalized. And I think that that's a very, very key takeaway. And that's what 3D printing's core strength is.
Sure. And I'll touch on this offline maybe, but drug delivery systems and topical masks for patient-specific dosage is a very proven use case and something that's already taking place, I think, for all of us. What it means to be human, I think there's a lot of conversation about healthcare being a privilege or human right in a number of different countries, including ours. And I think with the range of solutions on the, just represented by the three folks from industry here, hopefully, regardless of your budget and regardless of your pathology or need, you can access a better quality of care.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys so much for sitting on this panel, and thank all of you panelists for your wonderful responses and participating on this. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.